Hi, welcome to Give Me the Bible, where God's Word speaks for itself. In the last video, we looked at just the general approach to New Testament letters, but in this video, we want to talk about looking for clues and really, trying to be a detective in some senses of reading a letter and really trying to figure out what's going on. Why did Paul or whoever wrote the letter write what he did? And we want to use 1 Corinthians again as our example, because as you read through the letter, you're going to find clues. You're going to find little things that will basically indicate what's going on and why this letter is being written. For instance, when you're in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, you'll notice that Paul in verse 10 tells them to not be divisive, to not have any divisions among them. But notice what he says in verse 11. For I have been informed concerning you, my brethren, by Chloe's people, that there are quarrels among you. So Paul's saying, actually, I've heard about what's going on in your congregation, okay? And it's not good. There are quarrels, there are divisions. And so Paul starts to address those divisions and to tell them to stop that. And then he starts to talk about the wisdom of God versus the wisdom of the world in verse 18. Down through verse 31, he's talking about this contrast between worldly wisdom that's all about fame and status and prestige that they're really buying into, and yet they need to remember that the cross is from God. It's not based on worldly wisdom, it's based on the wisdom of God. And so as Christians, they need to be basing their lives on a different form of wisdom. That's something obviously that was a problem in the church. He talks to them about a little bit later in chapter 5, there was a man in sin in their congregation, just actively sleeping with his father's wife. Later on, he discouraged them in chapter 6 for having lawsuits against one another. All right, so, there's just a lot of sins that Paul heard was going on in that congregation. And so he's writing this letter to help correct those sins, to tell them to straighten up and start living like they should live as Christians. But also, what's interesting is, for instance, in chapter 7 and verse 1, you notice something here. Chapter 7, verse 1, now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Now, apparently, from that verse, you get a clue that they had actually written something to Paul, that this church wrote to Paul asking him some sort of questions about issues, and particularly here in chapter 7 about whether a man should have any sort of sexual relations with a woman whatsoever. And what's interesting is you notice as you read through, Paul actually addresses different things that they wrote to him, and he uses the phrase now concerning. So for instance, in chapter 7 verse 25, now concerning virgins. Okay, chapter 8 verse 1, now concerning things sacrificed to idols. Chapter 12 verse 1, now concerning spiritual gifts. Okay, chapter 16 verse 1, now concerning the collection for the saints. Basically, he's just taking them through and answering the questions that they asked him about these various topics in a letter. So already we're seeing these clues that there's obviously some sort of correspondence that's been going on between Paul and the Corinthians, that they wrote him a letter, and sometime before he sent them this letter of 1 Corinthians, it's just obvious that he was reported, or that somebody reported to him, that Chloe's people reported him that bad stuff was going on. And so not only when Paul wrote back was he answering their questions, but he was also rebuking them for their sins. And we find out where Paul was, because at the end of the book in 1 Corinthians 16, he says in verse 8, 1 Corinthians 16 verse 8, I will remain in Ephesus until Pentecost. So we learn that Paul's actually in Ephesus when he writes this letter to the church in Corinth. And remember, when you coordinate that with the book of Acts, that's very helpful to provide context, because in Acts chapter 18, that's when Paul establishes the church in Corinth for the first time. And we learn that he actually stayed there for a year and 6 months. And then later he left, went back home to Antioch, and later went to Ephesus and was in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19 for a period of about 3 years. And it was sometime in that 3-year period that Paul wrote this letter to the Corinthians. So that's just a very brief example. Obviously, we don't have much time in this video, but a very brief example of how you can pick a letter apart and look for clues about what's going on, why Paul wrote what he did, where he was when he wrote it, and really what the big picture and the main points of the letter are. I sure hope that that's helpful and that's clear. Lord willing, I'll see you next time.